for being here tonight and for offering us your thoughts. I know International Men's Day is actually tomorrow, but I didn't want us not to mark it. We have marked it for several years now, and it seems important that we continue to do this as our notions about gender continue to evolve, and of course, as we want to recognize all those who are really trying to challenge the most difficult and damaging forms of masculinity and bring us examples of other ways of being. So I'm simply going to follow the order in the beautiful advertisement that Shane put together. I'd like to give him credit for all the work he's put into this and also for running the Zoom tonight. And I'm hoping that maybe he will present next year and introduce our International Men's Day event, which I hope will be face-to-face. So I'll hand over to Christopher.
I'm gonna try to share my screen real quick, maybe, let's see if it works.
Wonderful.
Okay, we're good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to be quick with my 10 minutes. So hi, everybody. Most people, I guess, here know me, but my name is Christopher Jones. I'm a PhD student athlete with the Department of Sociology. And just really quickly, I just want to kind of shed light to some of my research. So let me put it up here. So this is like my thematic analysis. I use thematic analysis, and this is like my developing themes for my analysis. So I study student perceptions of race, and racial inclusion. I did one-to-one semi-structured interviews of Black and white students here at Durham University. And these are just some of the themes that came up. I was going to briefly go over it really quickly, then we can go into the event. So for instance, you have archaic acceptance, elite formations. So like students describe Durham to have like an elite reputation, but this elite reputation was founded off of different types of inequitable foundations. So for instance, contributing to slavery, and owning a colony, I believe, in Barbados, the Durham Cathedral did. And also trump cards is like, I don't know if people play cards, but it's like a suit. So basically like, it's just like to the typical Durham student and the type of identity Durham like attracts and accepts as far as during the student cohort. And that's typically like white, middle of the class, private school, probably educated, or or affluent, if that makes sense. So also whiteness is capital. This is kind of just sheds light to white skin capital. So by virtue of being white, you have a capability to fit in Durham, in and outside of Durham University spaces. But ultimately, there's different types of aspects, like say white working class have experienced different types of inequalities and different types of within their experience as well. And also the Black reality. So that is like pretty much the main theme. It talks about the experiences of Black students within Durham University and how, I guess, they kind of experience a quadruple disadvantage. So for instance, in Durham University spaces, alienated by the students just for being Black, I guess, in their culture, and then also the wider university experience, so not really being able to fit in within the local community, right? And then so what I did was I used the students' perceptions for recommendations and solutions. So my last two analysis chapters was about how students perceive Durham could be a racially inclusive institution. So for instance, decolonization, prioritizing Blackness, so like employing more Black staff, et cetera. And diet transformation just basically means like transforming the, I would say the dynamic between the racially underrepresented groups and the typical Durham student, which kind of like conflicts with each other. And that kind of highlights within my analysis. And also racial identity development is like pretty much basically like how you can transform your own racial identity to become anti-racist, right? But yeah, that quickly in a nutshell, that's kind of my research. So just to go into like masculinity, I guess. So I'm from Houston, Texas, right? I mentioned I was a PhD student athlete. So I'm a scholarship athlete with Durham. I play basketball. I played basketball my entire life. I play for the Tees Valley Mohawks, which is an amateur league team in Middlesboro, actually. And yes, and also, so yes, I love basketball. This is Tupac. He's a hip hop rap artist. So I love hip hop. I love rap. I love R&B. So I guess you could say that with this type of identity, I embody different types of the stereotypical Black male masculinity, right? And that's what I want to kind of get into. So I can clearly embody Black African masculine stereotypes, which is like athlete, likes hip hop, rap, etc. Right. And this kind of encapsulated how I was perceived as at an early age. So I was viewed as less than by my teachers. Many only saw me as an athlete, and that's also kind of affected my grade attainment, I would say. And also the politics of hair. So people would say like dreads are like anti-racist hair because of different types of policies put in place for people like me who don't feel included or can't be in certain spaces because of our hair. So for instance, when I was in high school, my coach had a rule that we couldn't have afros or braids because he said people could be, because he said that we didn't want to, he wanted us to look professional and not look like hoodlums and thugs. But meanwhile, my white teammates were allowed to have long, shaggy hair. So that kind of like, all of this kind of shaped my Blackness and what it meant to be accepted in a world that denied my Blackness, if that makes sense. And thus embedding anti-Black ideas in my conscience at an early age. So ultimately, it's not about what I embody for my masculinity, but how it is perceived and stereotyped by wider society as a Black African heterosexual man, right? Which is what I will get into in the later slides. Also, I'm a Pan-Africanist, so I'm a human rights activist, so I'm for all Black African unity across the diaspora and in Africa. So I'm for collectivism, humanism, egalitarianism. Also, I'm a twin. I don't know if people know this, I'm an identical twin, so you can guess which one's me. I'm on the right smiling. Yeah, and the one on the left, I guess he was considered the evil twin, but like we're kind of the same. But yeah, that's that's us two right there in a nutshell. But yeah, so in order to challenge stereotypical Black masculinity, we have to understand what they are, right? So for instance, the predominant stereotype of Black masculinity is of an unrestrained, predatory, and rapacious heterosexuality. So for instance, hypersexualized in history and presently. So for instance, in history, I say resilient Black African survivors, AKA slaves, during enslavement, when our ancestors were hung, I guess white men would castrate black men and keep their penises as trophies. Also, young Black men are stereotyped as threatening, hostile, and aggressive. So these threat stereotypes are even greater for taller Black men. So I'm 6'1", so I play basketball, so I don't consider myself tall, but I guess I'm taller than the average person, right? So this is also, especially in policing, so as people may not be aware that in the UK, Black men are 20 times more likely to be stopped and searched by police. This is similar to in America, as you can see with BLM, Black Lives Matter movement, and wanting to defund the police, et cetera, right? So these stereotypes that tall Black men are seen as especially threatening and tall white men are seen as especially competent. So that's kind of the issue, is that you can have similar characteristics, but because of our racial identity, we can be stereotyped differently and looked at as less than, right? Also, this kind of, the consequences of being stereotyped this way kind of has homophobic and sexist attitudes in Black heterosexual men. So for me, for instance, what I tell people is this stems from like religious and colonialism, religious backgrounds and colonialism. So me, myself, I used to be homophobic and didn't even realize it because a lot of that stemmed from my religious background. But if you look in research in Black African history, like around 2000 BC, 5000 BC, it was actually, there was no LGBTI plus laws. There was no discrimination around that, at least from what I've experienced. And also I put colorism, so like kind of to shed light on me being a lighter complexion Black man, I may not experience or be as much more of a threat than say my dark skinned peer, right? So what I would say is that my experience shows us that being a part of a marginalized group does not excuse us from being a bigot, right? But ultimately this shapes certain people's perceptions. So these stereotypes are exacerbated when we are left out of academia through racist policies, aka institutional racism, right? So racially underrepresented, so this asks you who's academically intelligent, right? So out of the 23,000 professors in the UK, fewer than 155 are Black. You have 112 Black male professors and 38 Black female professors. So boys who are Black African in particular are a target for stereotypical views that academia personnel describe as unteachable Black boys failing themselves. So this leads me to being racialized and other as an early researcher. Now, when I'm sharing the experiences, this is not to be negative. This is just to challenge, I guess, stereotypical Black masculinity, right? And how we are viewed in society, right? So for instance, I tell these people this, so what does a researcher look like, right? I tell people this story all the time about my first 2 weeks It's right here. It's on the left. So a student asked, I was in my the coffee break room in sociology department. And when I first got here, there was a seminar room next to our coffee break room. And a white student, a female, she came up to me and was like, that coffee machine is for PGR staff, PGR and staff only. And I was like, yeah, I know, I'm a PhD student. So I would say it's because of my black body, she questioned that. So you got to ask yourself, if I was white, if I was wearing a different type of clothing, would I be in question, right? But I try to look at myself, maybe I'm flattered because it means I look young or something, you know what I mean? I try to look at it from an optimistic standpoint, but that's just what it is. And these are my other experiences, but I don't want to take too much time. But yeah, so for instance, also when I was doing my research, I was looking for Black participants because it's very hard because there's not that many here. And even the Black participants that I was asking to do my study didn't even believe I was a PhD researcher, which is, again, embedded stereotypes of what does an academic look like, right? So at the end of the day, so this made me question, is this all because I'm Black, or is it because everyone else has been miseducated unconsciously or consciously in what a PhD student is supposed to look, act, or sound like, right? So I'm not looking for sympathy or anyone to feel bad for me. As you can see, all of us humans of different races and genders, et cetera, have to rehumanize and racially reconcile our identities, right? So even though I'm being stereotyped, racialized, othered by virtue of my identity, these unfortunate circumstances are opportunities to challenge stereotypes of Black African men that have been embedded in our psyche. So I'm okay with this, so future generations don't have to be stereotyped in this manner, if that makes sense. So I like to end it on this slide. So I mentioned about hip hop, et cetera, right? And these lyrics I will show are from J. Cole, one of my favorite Black African hip hop artists. They highlight the need to challenge and reconstruct how Black men are perceived in society. So typically when we think of poetry, we think of Shakespeare as universal, but all Black African hip hop artists are thugs and gangsters and seen to promote Black self-hatred. While some of the latter people may argue is true, many are speaking just from their lived experiences portraying their reality. So, however, it's seen that even William Shakespeare talks about different forms of rape, women being raped and shamed, right? But we still learn that in school, right? So in my thesis, I use different hip hop artists, et cetera, to highlight how poetically articulate they are and how their poetry highlights different realities in the Black African community. So I'm gonna share some lyrics really quickly. Excuse the content. There's probably like 2 bad words in it, but yes, just here we go.
You trying to be friendly, eh? She think I'm in the NBA. Why nigga can't have his MBA? Next time I'ma flip the script, kick some shit that's gonna shock her. Tom, what team do you play for? No, bitch, I'm a doctor. Flow hella proper.
Now, like, this sheds so much to my experience, right? So if you've seen one of the first bars, he talks about being stereotyped as being a basketball player, and he questions, why did she ask this question? I could be anybody else. I could have an MBA, I could have a master's degree, etc. Right? Man, ultimately, once he tries to flip the script, which is a lot of what I use in my research, is flipping the script to certain types of racial narratives. And then he mentions about being tall, which we mentioned before. So what team do you play for? He said, no, I'm a doctor. So I'm gonna play this every day when I get my thesis. This sheds light to my experience, like literally, like everything I've just shared with y'all. Like, it's just changing narratives on what an academic looks like, right? So ultimately, we are more than human. Well, we are more than athletes and musicians. We are intelligent, we are exceptional, we are successful, we are leaders, we are competent, and we are human ultimately. So, and that is everything from me. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now. Yep.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you.
No problem.
And I'm glad you brought some music in. If we were able to spend this throughout the evening, I think I'd be inviting everyone to play some music and might even sing along. But I'll spare you my voice, and move on then to Stephen. And I think we have another PowerPoint.
Yeah, hopefully if it works.
Christopher's went so smoothly, didn't it?
I know. Yeah.
No pressure.
Unfortunately, I'm going to be the disappointing second person. Unfortunately, can you?
Fantastic. This has come up beautifully.
Can you see it? Okay.
I can see it very clearly.
Oh, great.
It's even got all the Durham branding on it.
I know. It's terrible. I'm going to give like a really boring presentation now after Christopher's. But no, hopefully, I'll set a timer as well so I don't ramble on for too long, because I do have that tendency sometimes. I'm a researcher also in the Department of Sociology, actually. And I can talk to you a little bit about my research, and I suppose, yeah, a bit like Christopher, like my kind of position within that, I suppose. So yeah, so my research, I suppose, is very much influenced by feminism, feminist theory, activism, ideas, which I first kind of learnt about when I was at school, when I was at sixth form. I started doing sociology, and I just loved it. You know, it was amazing, and that's what I've been doing ever since, I guess. But yeah, like, and so you know, all of the different ideas I was learning there were having a really big impact on me. But feminism in particular seemed to have a really big effect on me, you know, in kind of explaining so many things about my life and about the world, and you know, where I am within that world, and in society. So yeah, I think it was it actually in a way like lifted a lot off my shoulders, in the sense of like, you know, a lot of the pressures and stuff which you experience when you're a teenager, like suddenly I could kind of make sense of those through this more sociological perspective, which was amazing. So yeah, I suppose ever since then, that's kind of inspired me to then want to do whatever I can to kind of share what I learned, you know, then and since then, I suppose with other people, and in particular with other men and boys, because it feels like, you know, a lot of men and boys just don't have the opportunity really to learn about feminist ideas, or they'll hear all these kind of stereotypes about feminism and whatnot, which kind of hinder them actually gaining an understanding of that, because I do think that we as men, you know, have so much to learn from feminism. And I suppose one of the things that it illustrated to me, of course, a huge aspect of gender inequality in society today remains, you know, the pervasiveness of gender-based violence. And so I felt like, well, you know, what can I do to support this movement? And it seemed like, you know, as a man, like speaking out about gender-based violence is a really important thing we can do. So kind of that's what my research is all based around, I suppose. Yeah, and I suppose if we look at different forms of gender-based violence, and you know, who's perpetrating them, it is predominantly men. You know, why is that? You know, there's so much research which shows that so much of that violence, and actually all forms of violence in society, actually often do come back to these rigid, restrictive ideas about being a man. You know, masculinity, and the expectations and the pressures around those, and around the idea that somehow being a man is equated with being powerful, being in control, both of yourself, but potentially also of other people. So yeah, I think, you know, challenging gender-based violence means asking questions about these ideas of masculinity really in society. But I think doing that actually, you know, we as men have a huge amount to gain from those kinds of questions and conversations, because again, there's huge amounts of research which show that actually these norms and expectations around masculinity are holding ourselves back, you know, in so many ways as well. So yeah, these ideas about associating masculinity with toughness or strength or unemotionality, never showing weakness, you know, those things in turn make it difficult for men to actually seek help if they're experiencing mental health problems or other difficulties in their lives, or to express, you know, the full range of human emotions that we all have, or to have kind of caring relationships with others. You know, somehow the idea it's not very manly to invest a lot of time and energy into caring for other people, for example. So I think, you know, in all of these different ways, we can see that these ideas about masculinity are having a really detrimental impact on a lot of men and boys as well as of course, as contributing to this violence towards women and other forms of violence. But I suppose at the same time, you know, I do think it's important as well that men and boys speak out about gender-based violence anyway, because, you know, that is the right thing to do. And because I think all of us do ultimately want to create a society which is more fair and equal and just. Yeah. And I suppose, yeah, but therefore, you know, I think we as men can make a real difference in our day-to-day lives, in wider society, if we do kind of speak out, not just about gender-based violence, but I suppose the kind of everyday, you know, sexism and misogyny which feeds into it really, because, you know, I think we do see that on a day-to-day basis in all sorts of different ways, but perhaps, you know, we find it difficult to challenge it, and we don't speak out because it isn't the norm to do that. The norm is just to go along with it, to laugh along if you hear a rape joke, for example, or just, yeah, one of those everyday kind of sexist comments. So yeah, I think, you know, we as men can be really kind of positive agents of change, I suppose, among our peers, you know, our friends, our colleagues, our family members, also in wider society, you know, challenging the kind of wider sexism we continue to see. I mean, also coincidentally, today is, I think it's Equal Pay Day. So after today, basically women, you can argue, are basically not being paid anymore because of the gender pay gap in society kind of thing, you know, compared to men. So we could speak about that, for example. We can reflect on our own kind of attitudes and behaviors. You know, are there moments when we might have stayed silent? And though that's not about blaming men or having a go at men, but it's about, you know, thinking, how can I do better in the future, I suppose. Yeah, and I suppose maybe that's all about ultimately trying to put into practice and normalizing healthier, more peaceful, more egalitarian ways of being as men, as humans. But I think it's important to highlight as well, actually, that, you know, a lot of men are already doing this in lots of different ways. A lot of men are challenging dominant expectations around masculinity. And I think it's really important to draw attention to that and to celebrate that, and the fact that there are these, you know, there are huge varieties among men. And I suppose, you know, there's a lot of kind of theory around the idea that we have, in different social contexts, there are always like different forms of masculinity, but some are valued more than others. And so, for example, you know, as Christopher was talking about, we in lots of settings, we continue to value forms of masculinity more, which are white or middle or upper class or heterosexual or able-bodied, for example. So yeah, we need to be challenging. I suppose it's really important to highlight as well how, you know, intersectional kind of inequalities always are connecting and playing out in relation to masculinity as well. Yeah, so I suppose for me, I think, you know, one of the things which I, you know, trying to achieve through my research is addressing the fact that, you know, we as men and as society as a whole, I suppose, are still, you know, far too silent a lot of the time about men's violence, really. But I think, again, it's important to highlight as well the power there, you know, that some men are in positions of power where they can make more difference or have the ability to speak out more than others. So yeah, you know, like me as a white man who's working in academia, who's coming from a relatively middle-class background, it might be easier for me to speak out than it is for some other men, for example. So yeah, again, thinking intersectionally, I think all men can make a difference and have a responsibility, but some men have a particular responsibility, I think. Yeah, and I suppose another thing I'd highlight as well is that, you know, these ideas, these patriarchal ideas about being a man, about gender, about relationships, you know, they're all over society. You know, we learn them as soon as we're born and throughout our lives. So that also means that unlearning them is a really challenging, like, ongoing process, which I suppose means that's something you're doing throughout your life, and you'll probably make mistakes at various points. And unfortunately, you know, like a one-off consent workshop on its own isn't going to be able to do that. You know, this is really like ongoing work we all need to be engaging in, I suppose. And perhaps for men, therefore, that is about as well, like listening to what women are saying at the same time as kind of speaking out among our friends and raising these issues among our friends, for example. But yeah, I suppose because of that, that also means that accountability for men is really important. Like, if we do want to get more involved in like anti-violence activism or anti-sexist activism, you know, that actually we are making ourselves open to being held to account if we do get something wrong, or yeah, but always being prepared to accept that kind of feedback and critically reflecting, I suppose, on how we can be a better kind of ally, as Christopher was mentioning. Yeah, otherwise there is the risk, I think, of perhaps even, you know, we can have the best of intentions, but we can still reproduce some of these kind of harmful masculine norms and these kind of gender inequalities, even within work or activism, which is seeking to tackle those very issues, really. Yeah, so just lastly, I think one thing I think it's really interesting and important to be having these conversations at the moment, because it feels like we're going through like quite massive social upheavals, really, in lots of different ways, and those are kind of shaking social norms, and of course that has a big effect on gender, and gender has a big effect on these different things as well. So thinking about the Me Too movement, that's created a huge amount of conversation and change in relation to sexual violence, for example. And then more recently, of course, the murders of Sarah Everard, Sabina Nessa, have really drawn attention to the continued pervasiveness of men's violence towards women in society. And then the Everyone's Invited campaign. So that's raising a lot of questions about masculinity. But also, of course, the pandemic, that's led to some, actually, obviously that's been horrific in all sorts of ways, but there have been some interesting changes there that at least some men have perhaps become more involved in things like fatherhood because they're at home more, they're working from home, perhaps in some cases, their schools are closed. So then they're engaging more in fatherhood. And could that lead to kind of long-term shifts in men becoming more actively involved in that and equally involved in that? And also, I think the climate crisis, that asks huge questions for all of us. And I think actually masculinity is, it's really interesting to think about how does that connect to the climate crisis and how are men responding to that? And will that kind of push at least some men to create more caring relationships with nature and the world around us? So yeah, I think all of these things actually are coming from, in lots of ways, they're really bad things, or they're addressing really bad things in society, but they also create opportunities for really important, much needed social change. But there is also, I don't think we should assume that will mean that things will just move forward in a progressive direction, because there is also big potential for backlash. And we see that in lots of different ways as well. But yeah, I suppose fundamentally for me, in this moment of like social upheaval, I think, we as men, should embrace conversations and questions about opening up definitions of masculinity and about dismantling these gender inequalities which have a massive impact on society still, because that means that we can become closer to our full human selves, and we can also create a more equal kind of society free from violence for everyone. Yeah, so thank you for listening. I'll stop talking. I should just mention as well is myself and a few colleagues have recently started a podcast talking about some of these issues called Now and Men. If anyone wants to check that out, you're very welcome. But yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That's lovely. And really, I think it was very helpful invoking the fact that sometimes moments that are very difficult can produce something better. I mean, Maya Angelou said that diversity means trouble, didn't she? Because if we don't create some trouble, then we don't change anything. And certainly I've witnessed some wonderful things happening amongst, young families around me who've been struggling in all kinds of ways with the demands that are made on them in terms of what's expected from them at work, and where the rest of life starts to be squeezed harder and harder. And it's not just that they've started, changing the dynamic in terms of being with children or caring relationships with parents and so on. It's actually, they've really questioned the whole basis of work in our current society and started making some decisions about sometimes taking on work that won't bring in the same kind of salaries, but will give them enough, in some cases just enough security that they can take back their lives and have much more say in how their energy and their time is expended. So later this year, we're hoping to do a series of sessions on the future of work from every possible perspective. But I do think that all of these things are deeply gendered, and they're also, deeply marked in terms of ethnicity and disability. And if something better can come out of the pandemic, then I think we all want to be part of trying to make that happen, don't we? So I'll now pass over to you, Luke. And thank you again, everyone. I think the openness with which you approached this is extraordinary. Sorry, Christopher, did you want to say something?
I was going to say amazing, Stephen. You were talking about mine, but that was amazing. Really good. That's all I want to say. I'll let Luke go, but yeah, that was great.
Well, I love them both. And, I've known Luke for a few years now, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Luke as well. So, Luke, over to you.
Yeah, I don't have any exciting presentation. Oh no, you just kind of look at my face. All right. Well, yeah, I was going to say hello and thanks again, Susan, for inviting me to contribute to this event. So yeah, as I said, like before, masculinities aren't primarily what I'm focused on, but they've been really relevant in just generally how like people's own gender identity links to how they interact with others and like So I'll explain what my PhD is in a second. But so I wanted to like focus on the relationship between masculinity as like something experienced and expressed by each individual person, and then we like masculinities on a societal level. So to think about like what are we doing for ourselves and what are we doing for others when we sort of construct and present a certain masculinity. So with regards to my PhD, I'm looking at teachers in schools in the UK and why they might have particular attitudes and approaches to trans pupils and transgender pupils. So I thought it'd be useful to use like stuff from my PhD and use my interviews with teachers and what came up regarding from those interviews regarding trans peoples, LGBT people, and gender more generally, as an example to illustrate how their experiences, the teachers' experiences of their own gender identity. So particularly in this context, male teachers and masculinity, how it affects their interactions with others, including their LGBT, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, plus, and trans peoples. So when I had slides, it was going to be on the slide, but I'll just read out a quote here. It's from Chris, pseudonym. So the pseudonym given prior to this talk, Chris. A sixth form teacher in the northeast of England. He's cisgender, male, heterosexual. He was talking about, if it's right, in his 40s, he's talking about a pupil who's previously in one of his classes at the sixth form. Okay, so he said about this pupil, he would wear full makeup, just foundation, blush, everything. I don't wear any, but I do in media studies, we do look at people like James Charles, Jeffree Star, and you know, that kind of like rainbowy sheen, you know, on his cheeks. He looked magnificent, you know what I mean? He'd walk in and you'd go, why can't I look like that? You know what I mean? He made me think I should start wearing makeup. I'd look a lot better. So he was sort of very sort of laughing during that quote, you know. So this quote I felt illustrated to me a positive form of masculinity. It also came across, you can imagine, like as a positive approach to a pupil expressing what might be considered gender nonconformity. So this stood out to me as a real contrast to some other stories. So both, you know, what I personally am a trans person, I know a lot of trans people, their school experiences, and also a lot of research literature where gender nonconformity, transness, queerness is punished in a school context. So I was saying, in contrast to sort of a more, you might say, traditional, maybe damaging masculinity, and one that you might associate with what is the privileged normative discourse, top of the social gender hierarchy status. And you think sort of a lot of like this type of damaging masculinity that's expressed through a real defensiveness of their own masculinity. So a defensiveness, a perception of deviance from normative gender roles by someone else is perceived as a threat. And for example, like a teacher in this context might punish pupils for this or not allow certain things on the basis of gender. So Chris, in this example, he's comfortable appreciating the aesthetics of men wearing makeup. And I also wanted to highlight that he also appears comfortable with the idea of himself doing so. He doesn't experience that as a threat. He doesn't experience it as a threat to him, his identity as a man, or to the legitimacy of his masculinity. So if I just like bring up a particular theory, so researcher called Bronwyn Davis and uses the term category maintenance work. And uses that to describe how men and boys might express the more defensive form of masculinity. So they maintain these normative gender categories by punishing others who deviate from the expected role. And in doing that punishment, they're intending to differentiate themselves from those others. And it is the work of protecting themselves and their perceived masculinity and protecting sort of the relative privilege and power that they get from a higher position and sort of protecting themselves from being subjugated themselves. So Chris, in the example, has subverted potentially a dominant societal expectation in not punishing a gender non-conforming pupil, and indeed, while doing the opposite of differentiating himself, is positioning himself alongside that pupil in sort of the realm of makeup wearing possibility. So as an individual, he could express a positive masculinity, and as a result, create a more supportive and safe environment for gender non-conforming, queer, trans, etc. young people. by choosing to respond differently to others who transgress gender norms. And then this is where I go, however, sort of on a totally different point, and where sort of I think you've covered before about sort of different intersectionalities of marginalization and things like that. These forms of positive and subversive expressions are not necessarily equally accessible to all men and masculine people, you know, for example, a masculine non-binary person. So particularly those who are otherwise marginalized and for whom challenging traditional and damaging masculinities can come with significant risk. So I was going to particularly talk about like my perspective as a trans man. But so I was just going to bring up here like a point that Judith Butler in particular makes, that heterosexuality, so being straight, is an important part of a person being perceived as normatively masculine or normatively feminine. So it's not what is considered a normative male presentation is not, it's inextricable from a heterosexuality. A threat to a sexuality, as a heterosexuality is a threat to one's gender. So if we look back at the category maintenance work and sort of maintaining this gendered hierarchy, differentiating oneself from both subjugated masculinities, so that would include gay masculinities, and indeed from women, that's part of this category maintenance work. So actually expressing things like homophobia and misogyny, so sort of, you know, casually sexist talk, you know, casually homophobic talk, is part of constructing oneself as normatively masculine. So they're actually part of one's own like identity presentation and construction. So if a man is to challenge expressions of damaging masculinity, like misogyny, he risks bringing the legitimacy of his own masculinity under suspicion. So I said I was going to talk about my own experience as a trans man, and I guess now I'm many years into transition, and I'm I guess fortunate, or in some, you know, I sort of tend to be perceived as male in casual context. I pass in inverted commas, and I might have felt a lot more precarious earlier into transition, and of course for a variety of different people in a variety of different contexts, you're balancing the risk of challenging certain challenging damaging masculinity. So Stephen, you sort of discussed about how maybe like some men have more power to do certain things, but it's sort of the legitimacy of masculinity thing is interesting. So I get sort of, I think quite a few people and other trans men have sort of discussed things like you might be in a group of otherwise cisgender men, they try and get you to join in on casually sexist comments. And now at this point, I'd at least like to think that in the majority of situations, I would openly challenge that, but there's always sort of a risk balancing situation. So I've been looking at sort of, there's some research that sort of discusses compensatory masculinities. So it can be true of all men, sort of cisgender and transgender men. So sorry, cisgender is just not trans, if I hadn't defined that. So particularly in context, so for trans men, you know, if you look at some literature, particularly in contexts where we might be at risk of violence, it can be an act of safety to compensate from what, you know, from a cisgender normative perspective is perceived as a lack of legitimate maleness because of maybe birth assignment or biology, etc., or physical aspects. And in some contexts, you participate in traditional or damaging masculine things in order to assert one's maleness. So you might overcompensate in asserting like sexist comments or asserting heterosexuality in order to compensate for a concern about deficiency in perceived masculinity in other contexts. So when I said I also wanted to talk a little bit, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. Should be okay. About sort of individual, how we treat ourselves in terms of masculinity, because I guess maybe for a lot of trans men, like I actively want to present a form of masculinity that is not damaging, but I find maybe for a lot of for men who experience other marginalities, you can, I don't want to bring in loads of Foucault here, but sort of, you know, that you end up exerting the discipline against yourself. Not just, so you might compensate not just in terms of sexism, but even if you not necessarily intentionally doing it. But I feel that you live in a society where openly expressing positive, like, transness is an act of resistance against normative power, including gendered normative power. But power and the systems of it do not just acquiesce to that. There's always fight back from that side as well, I guess, in simple terms. And in asserting that form of masculinity, I also found that this is just like one example for me, but for example, I've tended to assert like a sort of physical discipline on my own body in order to create that as physically masculine. So that can sort of come out in terms of like disordered eating, compulsive exercise, things like that. And these are forms of making, there's sort of insidious forms of making the body docile that affect men and all people. But, you know, your masculinity is in ways that are both in terms of how you perceive your own masculinity and in terms of how that interacts with masculinities in society. So I guess the main thing I wanted to sort of my point in terms of positive masculinities is considering how you're sort of resisting the damaging nature of more damaging masculinities, both in terms of society in general and how you're considering your impact on other people and gender relations, and also how it's a positive masculinity in your relationship to yourself, and the body and things like that. So that was the part of my talk that was the least, there was just sort of thoughts, but just sort of overall, I guess I would say like, I would say like, there's the problem of individualizing problems. So saying the responsibility of challenging, damaging masculinities is individual. And there's also a problem of saying, oh, it's a structural issue, I can't affect this. And it's sort of neither and both, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So each act of sort of subverting or challenging a damaging, destructive masculinity sort of is contributory to the overall goal of creating more space in society for others and for a more diverse range of masculinities that don't meet maybe the hegemonic status. And it creates an environment that's safer not only for like trans men, for example, but other groups who are subjugated or deemed insufficiently masculine. So like I'm disabled as well, so like disabled men or sort of men of color from certain groups, for example, who are perceived not to meet sort of the sort of Western standards of masculinity, and all sorts of different groups along different lines. And we're sort of trying to create an example that's safer for people of all genders and trying to reduce this like category or maintenance work and punishing deviance from assigned gender roles. Thank you.
I can't thank you enough, Luke. You know, I mean, that's also a very intimate presentation, but also with that, you know, strong theorizing. And it takes me back, you know, I was teaching Judith Butler here several decades ago, and I wanted, I think, to bring some of that back here, because for me, a lot of the things that we're discussing today are not new in that sense, are they? And on the one hand, that fills me with horror, because how are we not somewhere better already? On the other hand, it reminds me that there is a whole history there of, you know, attempts to change things, of whole generations of people who still feel solidarity and are looking for ways to express it. You know, my generation, we want to be good allies, and we're reaching out to find out how we can do that now in 2021, as opposed to the way we envisaged it in the 1970s or the 80s. But I think the willingness to be vulnerable, which all three of you have in different ways tonight, that to me is immensely powerful, because vulnerability seems to be the greatest fear of everyone I come across, whether it's people who seem to hold a lot of power or whether it's people who feel themselves to be very powerless. Vulnerability does shake us up, doesn't it? And to be willing to express it and to share it with others, I think, is an act of immense strength. So I'm really grateful to you for doing that tonight, and to all three of you. I suspect that, I mean, Santi had to go, I think, but if we could have just a few minutes, I certainly have some questions, and I'm aware that it'd be nice for all of you to get away a bit earlier than planned. But one of the things that struck me for all three of you was that the discourses, the social discourses, we live them in a very embodied fashion. We live them in our bodies, on our bodies, through our bodies. And all of you have experienced in some way attempts to either misrepresent you because of your bodies, or have also experienced ways in which you've been trying to discipline your own bodies, either in order to fit in some way, or in order to challenge as well. So Christopher, when you were talking to me about hair, which again, it was an issue back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and here we go again. Still, you're being told that your hair is too much in some way, and that it has to be controlled, whereas your white peers on the team don't have to do that. And that is your hair, that is a living part of your body. Or Luke, talking very eloquently about what it feels for you, what your embodiment means, and the fact that you're able to use Foucault to analyze how this happens, but you talk about the ways in which you find yourself inflicting particular disciplines on your body, which can harm your health, and you have the awareness and the intelligence to see what's happening, but that will be multiplied across so many people, won't it, who don't have the tools. And then Stephen, you talked about how sociology became that tool for you and a comfort in your teenage years, which is great. I mean, my comforts tended to be more musical, like Christopher's perhaps, but to have that kind of analytical toolkit to start making sense of what was happening to you and what you were feeling. So I think from all of you, what I get is that actually you're all wonderful men, the kinds of men that I would love to see around me every day. But you've all experienced just how difficult it can be to simply inhabit your own bodies. I still feel that you're all making a difference, and that when I look around me, I can see all kinds of media and all kinds of ways in which people are trying to make a difference. If we bring it back to university, because one of my concerns is that I'm working primarily surrounded by young students and some more mature students, thankfully, it's whether you feel that the kinds of interventions that we're trying to do in a more organized level, so that's everything from active bystander, the consent work that you referred to, Stephen, Christopher, you've been doing a lot of active anti-racism work, and have promised to help us in Aiden's when you finish writing up. So I actually have confidence that those interventions do matter, that we need to keep working on them, we need to keep improving them, they need to multiply, they need to not just be one-offs, but become more woven into our curricula as well as our everyday lives, whether that's inside a college or whether it's outside in Durham City. Tell me whether you share my optimism. You've been coming here tonight giving us things to celebrate, but I felt a tinge of sadness, a healthy intellectual skepticism, which of course we have to have, but I do hope there is some optimism there as well.
Sorry, Stephen.
No, I was just going to say, who wants to go first?
As I definitely see positives in, I think it is, doing things like these trainings, like people are always going to criticize them, but I think like it is definitely important and useful that they become normalized and expected. I even saw like you get advertised news stories, and one trying to, the way that the headlines are sort of constructed, sort of trying to phrase it. There's something in Cambridge where they're trying to suggest on this news story that the new freshers at one of the colleges are being forced, shock horror, to do an anti-racism seminar as a condition of entering. And I was just like, I remember sort of like, good, but it's sort of a sign that it is becoming sort of part of the like expectations. And obviously it has huge problems with the way that the reporting of it is presented, and it's coming across in a lot of ways, and it's being, these things are being framed as sort of threats to freedom and academic freedom and things like that, which is something which is a big concern, I guess, with, you know, trans things particularly, and a lot of other things. But I guess I think it is becoming something that, regardless of the media, people outside the context, I think it's a lot more problematic than it is because of the way it's presented, and it is expected now at universities, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and people are asking us for it. I mean, again, that's one of the reasons I'm happy, because I feel that there's a bit of a groundswell, and I'm not downplaying the research you've done, Christopher, and I'm well aware of the kind of profile of Durham students, the majority of Durham students. But I have to say, one of the things that's really welcome to me is to see a shift from, well, some of us feel we ought to be doing this, to, as you say, Luke, people expecting it, and I would say people welcoming it. That's a huge shift that I've seen just in the space of a few years. And it won't be, it's certainly not universal, but I think that the people who object to it will become fewer in number. And what I'm hoping is that actually a lot of the people who may currently feel that they benefit from particular kinds of dominant masculinities will actually start to see the damage that those do to our planet. It might be through that particular perspective, because the environmental awareness is particularly heightened at the moment, or they might start to see it in terms of intimate relationships, because a lot of people of all genders are asking more of their relationships now. They're really not prepared to put up with particular behaviors, and those kinds of dominant and arrogant masculinities, I think, are not landing in the way that perhaps at some point they did. But anyway, you know me, I'm the eternal optimist. Let's ask Stephen and Christopher whether they share some of the hope.
Christopher, do you want to go? Because I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Well, my optimism isn't but it depends on the context, geographical context as well, because I know I'm from Texas, and I don't know if y'all have seen in Texas, they banned critical race theory, they banned teaching Martin Luther King and the Ku Klux Klan, I believe. So it's a conservative type government. So it just depends. A lot of that is on geographically as well. But I mean, I try to be a racial realist, and I don't know, I try to be optimistic, but part of me, it's difficult because even from my research, even the white participants were talking about how it's called two-faced racism. So it's the fact that now the newer generation is being taught to be racist, essentially, if that makes sense. So people are taught to be politically correct, right, but their embedded attitudes aren't changing, if that makes sense. And that can go intersect with any other different type of protected or personal characteristic, if that makes sense. So it's difficult in a way, but ultimately for me, like it's like what Stephen mentioned about people in power. People in power having to adjust and shift different policies in order to, and I guess the whole point about the whole training thing, it's good because you can't really make excuses, if that makes sense. So when you have that as a requirement, it's like, okay, this was here, so you have to do this, so you can't conduct this type of behavior, if that makes sense. But I know a lot of research I look into is like, it's more about policies than necessarily attitudes. but I feel like people in power, like, it's gonna take a while for them to even change anything. But so I do believe in changing attitudes at an early age, if that makes sense, compared to like, say, how old we are now. And like you mentioned, like, it takes a lot of courage to be like Stephen and Luke and be able to, like you mentioned, challenge masculinity, like the different stereotypes, if that makes sense. As you can see with this the meeting, like we have how many people, so it's a shame because y'all had some great thoughts and stuff like that, if that makes sense. So men were typically privileged, so I guess people who are more privileged don't really care much about inequality, if that makes sense. That's why when you have these type of things, you have more women involved, if that makes sense. So, but yeah, for me, we'll see. I don't know how much better it's going to get anytime soon, but like you said, it's holding people accountable is the main thing right now. So yeah, I'll let Stephen go, but yeah, we'll see.
I mean, you are all breaking my heart, but I will say that when a state or a government bans something, that means they're really scared about what it brings. And, you know, banning historically, it doesn't keep things down forever. It really doesn't. But it's making quite a statement about the power of what is being said or what is being sought, I think. So, Stephen.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because I think that like some of the backlash to because I think backlash is a real issue, isn't it, in relation to lots of different social movements, which, and it is quite scary because actually it's quite vocal and powerful in some contexts, as was just being described. But I think you are also right in a sense that like often it is a kind of fear, right, that actually they're losing the argument, and so like how people were responding in the UK around like football players taking the knee, for example. Like I think that like some people were booing, but actually I think they also realized that actually most people actually could see why the players were doing that and were supporting them. And you know what I mean? So I think there is an element there where the argument is gradually being won, but just far too slowly, I suppose. But yeah, like, I think I agree with what Chris was saying as well about because I think there have been real steps forward in recent years around universities and gender-based violence. But I think fundamentally that has only come about because of activism, right? And it's the same with like decolonizing the curriculum. Like that is becoming on the agenda because of students, staff campaigning on it. But the problem then is, of course, is that then institutions take that on, which is good, but it starts to become like depoliticized, like all of the actual meaningful content of that gradually is taken away. And it's like, it becomes quite a tokenistic thing. And it becomes, and that is a real challenge, isn't it? Because we want that, like, we're not going to be able to create change unless this stuff is embedded within institutions. But how do we make sure that actually it does keep that? Because, for example, in terms of gender, like, and gender-based violence, like, for me, like the only way we can really tackle those issues is by having these kinds of conversations about things like masculinity and patriarchy and all these different social inequalities. But I feel like so often with the kind of prevention work that you see, all of that will be taken out of it, and it'll be very kind of bland, you know, degendered, like none of us should perpetrate violence, you know, and things like that. And that's, so that can be quite sad, but at the same time, it is these are steps forward.
Don't let me dissuade you from your optimism, Stephen. I'm sorry. Don't let me dissuade you from your optimism. I'm sorry. Please.
No, but at the same time, we have made those steps forward, haven't we? And then it gives you something to build on, and to keep challenging and keep pushing for more. And that's because I do think that is where any change comes from, is from people, mass movements of people pushing for it, as has been shown.
And yes, we will all have to try, won't we, to keep the decolonization agenda as a genuine one, a live one, a living one, an evolving one. I think it's really important that now people are trying to take it back across departments and across student groups, instead of it being in the purview of, you know, a pro vice chancellor. You know, it has to come, I think, from that ground, and then we all have to work to ensure that it remains meaningful. You do. And I think, Luke, obviously you've been doing a lot of work in schools, and Christopher, you too were talking about the importance of changing things amongst children. And that's partly, of course, because while, as you said, Stephen, whether it's gendering or racism, they begin, well, before people are born, actually. While babies are still in the womb, it's already happening. But then you're born into that, and then you're having to navigate it. But at the same time, there is still this moment of real openness. I mean, that was something, watching my own children, it just never failed to absolutely dazzle me, because their ability to look at the world in ways that I had lost, or to ask questions that actually open things up in quite extraordinary ways, that was really wonderful. So I'm obviously, since I'm working in a university, that's one of the spaces that I'm trying to be active in and be a good ally in. But schools, that's a whole other area, isn't it? And look, your research, which is so vital. I was really grateful today that you picked out that example, because I know you've also found some very difficult things in your research. It might have been easier to find some of the more negative and recalcitrant examples than the lovely one you shared with us. But given that yes, change takes time, if you had to point to one thing or one movement or one piece of music or one film that for you does embody something that you want to celebrate, something that makes you feel fully you, in the way that you talked about that rap song earlier, Christopher, that you really saw yourself in that. Or look, I remember when there was a film showing, gosh, pre-COVID, and you were on the panel and you were saying, well, this is not really a film, by trans people for trans people, but it's quite a good starting point for, cisgendered.
I guess it
people.
was sort of the type of film you'd want cisgender people to see,
Yeah.
as part of some of the things, but it would just be, it's a sort of film that kind of, it shows a lot of the negative side that you don't necessarily just want to, like, you as a trans person, about, and you just watch more sadness, but like, it's important for people to know. So it's a good film, but I probably, like, if I was having a relaxed night in, I probably wouldn't be as to watch.
So, my question to you was, well, when you come across one, let me know. Do we have one yet?
Let me think trans-wise, because like when you first started the question, like the film Pride, I think is amazing and really like does, like the solidarity in that film. And it's a very emotional film, and like you have to, but like that film is very meaningful to me. But I was just trying to think, like, what, there's definitely a lot of like media made by trans people and like but that was the first thing that jumped to mind when you said what sort of encapsulates positive change, because I don't know if you know that film is about like
I
gay
love
and
it.
lesbian support the minors,
Exactly.
and like there was a huge change where like there's a lot of like they went to a mining village and there was a lot of homophobia there, and then then at the end, not to spoiler it, but it is kind of history. But like loads of mining villages came on huge buses for the Pride Parade in London.
Yeah,
And then you cry every time you watch it.
exactly. No, it's a great
film.
Yeah, it's a great film. I love it, and I'm glad you could give me something to mend my broken heart. That's wonderful. We'll watch it together. So, Christopher, Stephen, is there anything that you can?
I don't know. Maybe a recent film. I don't know if you've seen Judas and the Black Messiah.
Oh, I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard a lot about it. Yes.
Yeah, Daniel, he won an Oscar, didn't he?
Yeah.
But basically, it's about people in the Black Panther movement and Charles Hamilton, and a lot of that kind of coincides with my research, because a lot of what he does is it's kind of what happened during COVID after George Floyd, where a lot of the white working class and Black activists were he was trying to get the white working class together with Black activists and just getting more people together. And then obviously he was a threat, so the police got rid of him. Obviously they murdered him. But it's just kind of like what Stephen was mentioning about how a lot of this I mentioned in my research, when people in power perceive a threat, they do certain things. right? So, but then also that means that change is happening. But the whole point is that when the people perceiving the threat do something, what are we going to do as activists to respond, if that makes sense? So that's the main thing. But that would be the movie I'd say that I've seen recently. That is something to watch, Judas and the Black Messiah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Stephen.
I'm really appreciating this because I was literally also going to say Pride, so so thank you for saying that. But I also really need to see that film, Chris. So thank you for the reminder. Because is it on Netflix? I think, is it on Netflix?
It's not on Netflix yet.
Okay.
Very good.
I'll find a way to see it anyway. Thank you. Yeah, but because Pride was the only one I could think of. But I can give a little anecdote about music, because I thought what Chris was saying about that was really interesting and important around in terms of masculinity. And I was actually talking to Zuzka about this the other day as well, because I'm mainly into metal music, and that was why I first started like growing long hair. And I did get a bit bullied and stuff at school, because again, like if you step any way outside of these like confines of masculinity, then you're probably going to get picked on, right? And obviously hair is one aspect of that. But then like at the same time, like I am also very privileged. I'm privileged in all these different ways. So like the way that long hair, but being a white man, like that's just not pleased anywhere near to the same extent, obviously for a black man. So that's interesting in and of itself. And then with music as well, with metal music is often like very aggressive and like the lyrics and stuff like violent and misogynistic, but it doesn't get anywhere near the same kind of criticism or attention as like hip-hop music does, for example. So it's interesting again, isn't it, like how these different, on the one hand metal music is a bit of a kind of like a subculture, it's not mainstream or anything, but it is, I don't know, like how these complex power dynamics play out are really interesting, and I suppose important to reflect on as part of these conversations.
Fantastic. Well, I can't thank you all enough. And I'm really hoping we'll get to the point where, firstly, we can get some good films shown in the one cinema that we have in Durham now. And also when we can squeeze a few more people into the Lindisfarne Centre, because we've had some fantastic events there in the past. And again, we can show films there. And I do find film often enables people to open up. I think that's been our biggest challenge over the years, that often we'll have very eloquent people speaking like all of you, and then it comes to the sort of discussion and there'll be a few people who will ask questions, intervene, maybe also put themselves on the line a bit or offer examples. But what you really want is you want that big buzzing conversation, don't you? And then people to go away afterwards and carry on those conversations. So I think we found film really helpful in that respect. Anyway, as you can imagine, we'll be inviting you to anything and everything, but I know that you all have lives you need to go back to, and so what I'm going to do is just thank you all once again, and also again thank Shane. He's still hiding behind the anonymity of the darkened screen, but he's a really wonderful person, and I just, we couldn't have brought this off without him. So I'll just check whether there's anything in the chat that I've missed. Thank you, Susanna. Wonderful. And, you've all been absolutely wonderful, and I wish you great happiness, and I hope that we will all see some change in our time. So please look after yourselves. Thank you, and good night.
I do hope I can get back to Aden soon. It's been a long time since I've actually physically been in St. Aidan's. Yeah.
Well, we'll think of something really great that you'd enjoy and that you could contribute to. Look, I think we are going to try to revive CSGS in January, but COVID has surprised us so many times. We'll see if we manage to pull that off. Lovely.